Today's episode might be kind of an unexpected one because we're going to be speaking to occupational therapist Dr. Allie Ticktin. And when people hear the word occupational therapist with respect to kids, they often think of, toddlers and sensory gyms jumping into ball pits. But in fact, our conversation with Allie highlights how important it is to think about sensory integration with respect to growing kids, tweens, teens, kids in puberty, kids managing changing bodies, kids managing hormonal ups and downs. In fact, Allie makes the case that kids who have been in occupational therapy, or maybe who have never been in them, but need help understanding their bodies, learning what their bodies are telling them, learning how to manage, how to respond to different situations and feelings inside their bodies. This is a great time. Puberty and adolescence is a great time to revisit occupational therapy. Allie's based in New York. She's the founder of Play to Progress, which is a center in Los Angeles with all different kinds of occupational therapists, although Allie specializes in sensory integration. And her life's work is to empower children and families through play, which is a beautiful aim. And you'll hear when we speak to Allie that her whole approach is so in line with Cara and my approach with any of this stage of life, which is to step away from judgment, to step away from shame, to step away from the concept of what is normal, and to give kids a chance to just be who they are in themselves and to help them be the highest functioning version of themselves they can possibly be. So enjoy. Allie, thank you for joining us on This Is So Awkward.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
We have so much to talk to you about, and we're going to plow through so many questions because we want to cover a million topics with you. But the first topic is something that our very science-educated listeners may not realize, which is people think there are 5 senses, but in your book, Play to Progress, you educate us that there are actually 8 senses. So can you move quickly through what those 8 senses are?
Absolutely. So I'm going to speed through it, but there's really so much detail here. So our first quote unquote hidden sense, I don't love that word because my goal is to get these senses out in the open, is proprioception. A lot of people may have heard of proprioception. It's essentially where our body is in space. Our second quote unquote hidden sense, again, is vestibular sense. Now, where I find most people hear about their vestibular sense is with vertigo, especially adults. But our vestibular sense is really our relationship with gravity. So where is my head in relation to gravity? And so our sense of movement, right? Our third hidden sense is interoception. This one, very important for our teens. And this is our internal awareness. How I describe it for the littles is, do I feel that I have to go potty, right? But what are all those feelings in my body? What does that mean? Does that grumble mean I'm hungry or I'm nervous? Things like that.
Will you talk about, because we had a therapist on recently who specializes in working with autistic people and autistic teens. And she talked about the impact of a lack of interoception, what that means for people going through puberty and through adolescence. And I'm curious what your observations have been about that sort of not lack of interoception, but maybe less developed interoception and how that impacts kids in the adolescent years.
Absolutely. And I would listen to that episode. It was a great episode. Also, I have to give a big shout out to an OT named Kelly Mahler. She really is the expert on interoception, and I highly recommend looking her up. But when I think of interoception and what I see with especially our adolescents as our kiddos, if you aren't in touch with your body, you're not going to understand what your body is telling you, right? So if I can't understand what my body is telling me, what might happen? We have some teen girls who are still on occasion having an accident. They just don't feel they have to go, right? But this can really expand in so many different ways. How I think of it with myself, I have an autoimmune disease. I certainly myself have many sensory challenges. And I had to learn what my body was telling me. It did not come natural to me. And so that's the piece being, I understand what that means in my body. There's still so much work being done on interoception, and we have so much to learn about it, but I really do find it to be extremely fascinating and really an important piece into helping kids understand their body, their nervous system, and what they need and what their body is telling them.
It's amazing. It feels a lot like the idea that intuition is learned, right? Your gut sense about something is learned. Interoception, while innate, is learned. And every single one of us can think of examples in our own current life. I mean, as adults who are, supposedly fully grown, we all have an interoception hole somewhere along the way, right? So for me, Vanessa knows this because she watches me on Zoom all day, every day. Vanessa can identify when I'm hungry before I can. She sees it. And that is interoception. It's such a big piece of the human experience, being able to learn how to identify what you feel inside and then have control over your body in a certain way. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to bring you onto the podcast, is that a lot of people would assume that based upon what you do, your work is really targeted at younger kids. And yet, everything that you do is applicable, I would argue, to everyone, but certainly to people whose bodies are changing day to day, month to month, year to year in the puberty journey.
How I think of sensory really is, we need to help kids, and not just kids. We need to help every single person, including parents, by the way, because the parenting journey, I believe, is highly impacted by their own sensory system. But we need, in general, all humans to understand their sensory system and how they move through the world in order to really understand what works best for me. I'm a really big advocate for, let's talk about the sensory system young and consistently and make adaptations knowing what your sensory system needs, especially in an education setting. And where are so many of our teens? They're sitting in a classroom all day that often is not sensory friendly.
Yeah. So can you talk about what sensory integration means as a kind of as a concept?
Absolutely. So I'm going to really take it low level, and there's so much more here. But if you think of it, how do we experience our world, right? We experience it through our senses. So I hear, I see, I feel, I touch, all these things. I have to take all this information and I have to process it. I have to organize it and create a response, right? So this information, we're also integrating different senses. So this is really what we're talking about. Now, the work we do in sensory integration, we're really looking at what's going on in a child's sensory system and where are they having. I've always had a hard time with the word challenge because I really see us all, indifference is really the right word, but even that, like, what is normal? I think we all have our sensory differences. My passion is more, let's just bring that out in the open and help people understand that and understand what their sensory system needs. But that's what we're really working on, is really understanding the sensory system and how to support it in regulation and how to help humans have the most efficient sensory processing.
Right. I mean, there's no one right way to integrate what is coming into your body. There is no one right way to smell or touch or feel or any of the 8 senses verbified. Given this framework that you have laid out for us about the 8 senses, about sensory integration, can you explain to everyone what an occupational therapist does and what it means to go to occupational therapy?
So that's such a big question. Why? Because OTs do so many different things. But what I'm going to talk specifically about is what I specialize in, which is sensory. And we really are just one piece to a much bigger picture. So, what I do in terms of sensories, I really look at a human's sensory system and I say, okay, what's going on? Where are maybe some things causing some difficulty, some challenges in life? And we really work on that piece. So that's what I specialize in. So what does it look like coming to me? One of the big things that I want to break the stigma on is there is a stigma and I really hate it, but there is truly, any sort of stigma going to any therapy that we really need to just completely break because normal does not exist. And the reality is, and especially with sensory, how many of us when I sit with parents in meetings, they'll say, oh my gosh, I just got thrown out of my classroom for that. Or I just thought I was a bad kid. Or I just thought that there was something wrong with me. So what I really care about and what is extremely important to me within the sensory world in the work that I do is really helping from kids all the way to adults, honestly, because like I said, the parents are part of it, understanding their sensory system and what their sensory needs are in order to help them function at their highest level. What does that look like in terms of kids, teens? It looks like learning, right? It looks like socializing. It looks like going to the movies, going out with friends, things like that. So those are the things that we're really talking about and specializing in, but that looks different in an adult.
Will you get more specific about that? Let's talk about the specific challenges, the obstacles built by sensory integration difficulties, right? What do those obstacles look like for an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 14-year-old?
I'm going to take it to one that is the easiest to understand. It's also one that I think people mostly associate with sensory, even though there is so much more. Sensory over-responsivity. What does that mean? So this is an issue in modulation. And say your little one cannot handle wearing a pair of jeans. Let me take it back to myself as a teenager. This started when I was a very small kid. I would not wear jeans. To this day, it is a massive struggle of mine, but it was a big problem in my teenage years because in the 90s, the low-rise jeans were all the rage. So for me, my body, what that felt like was pain. It was awful. I really, truly could not tolerate it. It impacted me heavily at school because I couldn't focus. I would get dysregulated. That's a word we're using. You may hear me use a lot. And so what does that mean? If I'm over responding, that means I'm having too big of a response, right? I may be going towards fight or flight. My body cannot handle this, a bigger response than what we would expect to this. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to impact every area of your life, including your self-regulation. Because if I am having this reaction, what might I do? I might lash out. Or maybe, and this was me as a teen, hold it all in. And then when I get home, let loose and really have a big outburst, right? So that's just one simple example, but it can look very different in many different kids. A kiddo might be moving, right? A teen, they lose recess. What happens when they hit middle school, high school, and they lose recess? Their body gets less movement. But what if they need that movement to regulate? What did we just do to their learning?
Yeah, Allie, talk about what you notice in terms of as kids' bodies begin to change and grow, as hormones are circulating in their brains and their bodies, as social realities get more complex and more challenging. What are you seeing in terms of the kids who you knew when they were younger or maybe new kids to the practice? What are the challenges and shifts that you're noticing as kids are getting bigger and older?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I have had a number of kiddos come back to me who I had when I was little And now as they're getting into the teenage years, they're presented with a whole new set of difficulties and a new set of challenges. One of those things that I'm seeing, and something you touched on, is these social pressures, right? So we may have figured out some things that really work for their sensory system, but they're not comfortable doing them in school.
Like,
And
give me an
so-
example. A kid who needs to like rock or move from foot to foot or something to manage their regulation. It's fine when they're 5 or 7, but now they're 12, right? And they're like,
Exactly.
Allie, this is embarrassing. I can't do this anymore.
So I'm going to give you a set example. A kiddo or a child who needs a chair that maybe provides more proprioceptive input. So more squeeze, more deep pressure is not technically proprioceptive input, but there's chairs that will allow them to kind of push against them. There's bands on the bottom of a desk that they can kick and get some feedback from, as well as what we call body tools. Body tools are essentially just what you may know of as fidgets. Why do we call them body tools? Because we're trying to normalize this is here for your body. And that's really important.
Can I just say, when fidget spinners came out, when they first became a really big thing, my kids were in grammar school and they were incredibly effective for certain kids in the classroom. But every kid loved the feeling of a fidget spinner, which I found fascinating. It was like, if it was centering for kids who had sensory integration, it was still mildly centering for people who didn't. And the teachers got so frustrated by every kid having a fidget spinner that they banned them from the classroom, which really ended up harming the people who needed them. So that's sort of an example, I think, of a tool that can go awry, right?
So you just brought up a great point, and I'm going to sidebar a little bit. Body tools. I am a huge believer. These need to be in every single class from preschool up through college. What am I sitting here doing right now? I took a baby plug protector off of the plug because I realized I didn't have a body tool. I personally, my sensory system, I cannot focus without one. I would not be able to make it through this podcast without something in my hand. Now, for some of our kiddos that are these preteens and teens, they're embarrassed by that. But if we switch that narrative, and this has been a big thing I'm fighting with some of the kids that I come back and I'm working with their teachers to say, can we introduce it to the entire class? What can we do to normalize this so that they don't feel different because it's impacting their learning, right? Without this tool, they are not able to efficiently and effectively learn.
Right.
But
I mean, what we see in the pediatrician's office is they find body tools that are inherent to their body. So they pick their cuticles, they peel their nails, right? They do things physically to their body to get that same sensory feedback. And ultimately, you get a kid who shows up at the end of the school day and their fingers are bloody. And, you're going, what gives? And what gives is they didn't have that actual body tool.
Absolutely. And what I always say, watch a human will tell you what their sensory system needs. So what that looks like in kids, watch a kid's going to tell you what their body needs, right? Now, are they going to do it in a productive manner? Often not. It might even look like a physical aggression. But if we don't normalize this in the classroom, then it's going to be a big problem. And I think it is a big problem. And that's where our teens, preteens, they're starting to take on this shame, because where it was okay when I was in kindergarten, now, wait a second, I want to fit in. I want to be like everyone else. And so even though this works, I'm going to do it secretly at home when I'm doing homework, or even with me, I'll work with them and say, let's come up with a way that we can bring this to your teacher. And often my suggestion is, I'm going to talk to your teacher. We're going to introduce it to the class, but you do not have to say you have even heard of it. And so that it's completely benign at that point. Even in that case, some of my kiddos, they do not want that. They're not comfortable with it. In fact, one of my preteens said to me, this is private. I don't want anyone to know.
Right.
And
It's so, Allie, it's so fraught. This is the time when they're comparing themselves to everyone else, where that word normal is like, should be thrown out the window and driven over with a Mack truck, because there's like really and truly no normal. And yet they often feel like they're the only one, that they're the only one feeling other or different or less than or whatever. And whatever an adult does or says is like immediately so mortifying and embarrassing, even if it's somebody like you who's a trusted adult, who's not a parent to them, who's, advocating and all of that. It's such a tricky line to walk. And so you're like, I know, because A, I've lived this, B, this is my profession, and C, I've watched all these kids through wonderful progress, and yet they have to be on board.
Although we do know that when they're not adult, they're not parent or caretaker adult, comes in with a suggestion, even if they push back hard, that suggestion seed gets planted in a way that I suspect, Allie, when these kids come back to you a week or a month later, some number of them have gone, I was thinking about that thing that you suggested and I want to try it now. And even their parental adult or their primary caretaking adult has that impact, but really someone in your role who's the person who swoops in to problem solve and offer strategies and tactics. Is that a fair scenario that you plant a seed? They say, I'm never going to do that. And then they circle back.
Absolutely. And I've had multiple clients who have come and they have done it. And there's something I want to bring up. It's called sensory health. They talk a lot about this at the Star Institute, which is a place that I really, really love. I really admire the work that they're doing there. And, I love that word. Why? Because sensory health, that's everything. Let's actually talk about what our sensory systems need. How many times as parents, when your kid is blasting music, do you switch into sensory overload if you're sensitive to noise? I'm a person that is. And so what happens? So there's all these pieces that if we started normalizing, actually just talking about our sensory system and recognizing it's actually not appropriate for everyone to just sit in a desk without moving for 8 hours of the day. Some of my preteens, I've said to their parents, like, what can we do to get the school to increase recess? Because 2 15-minute recesses, that includes lunch, is not enough.
No, it's not enough.
It's all it is they're on a basketball court, like one here in LA, we don't have a lot of space. So we don't have the play structures, the climbing, that stuff that's left for the littles.
Right. And they have to navigate all the game rule setting and the managing one another. I mean, there's so much lost in the missed recess of it all. And then can we layer in now screens? Can we start to talk about Vanessa's like,
well,
deep
Allie,
sigh.
I'm reading the book, and this is definitely a book. And by the way, I want to reassure everyone, this book is actionable, helpful, hopeful, positive, empowering. But what I'm about to say is there's aspects to it, which is about the impact of screen time on kids and their play. And I don't know if delays is an appropriate term to use, but I'm going to use it, and then you can correct me when you jump in, Allie. The delays in their sensory integration and their development because they're not having all the experiences in the muddy puddles and the wet grass, and they're not on the blacktop, and they're not running around and playing in all these different places and experimenting and moving their bodies in new ways. And the screen time, the less time outside, the less time playing, the less time experiencing the world is impacting their sensory integration. And I'm like literally thinking of all the ways in which I have, and Cara hears this like at least once a week. I think about all the ways I like did my kids dirty by like.
I think she's a great mother. I think she's
Thank you. But I was thinking about all the ways, and particularly during COVID and sort of like the screen time, the sedentary. And so if you could do two things for our listeners. One, talk about the impact of increased screen time, and then reassure people that there are ways to it's never too late. The horse is never, can always go back in the barn, in the sense that there are things we can do to help our kids and ourselves, even if there are challenges or delays or whatever.
Absolutely. So I'm going to preface this by saying this. I was very hesitant to put anything about screens in the book for this reason. I did not want parents to feel shamed. I know it is part of our world, and I recognize kids will be on screens.
And I didn't feel shamed by you. I'm really good at shaming myself. So,
but I also think
I'm going to buy you an affirmation mirror, Vanessa.
And this includes with adults. I spend too much time on my screen. But, when it comes to, and it's not just screens, I'm going to also draw it to toys with batteries and these electronic toys that really play for our kids. Well, where are we setting this baseline? The first 2 years of life, like those are the sensory motor stage of learning. What is that? Sensory motor. That is a key piece of development. It is so important that we are moving our body, we are engaging our sensory system from birth, but also now. And what's happening is we aren't anymore. So kids are moving a lot less. Teens are moving a lot less. Now let's add in a whole nother piece here. A child who struggles with coordination, which may be related to their sensory system, right? There's something called dyspraxia. It's naturally going to be more difficult for them to jump into the team sports. And you guys talk in your book about how team sports are getting so much more competitive. They're not just fun anymore. And there's just this extreme energy around them. Well, that child, it's going to be even more difficult to jump in. And it's going to be easier to go back towards screens. So that's a big piece I think about in the impact on a child's social life as well.
Allie, how do we both accept our child, the child who's in front of us, and love them and support them and guide them, and just say, like, this is who they are. This is their makeup. These are their strengths. These are their challenges. And when do we say, you know what? I actually think there's work we can do here. There's impact we can do here, so that the physical implications, the social implications, the self-esteem implications are mitigated by doing a little bit here and there. Like, is there still stuff we can do when our kids reach the tween and teen ages?
Absolutely. And so this is my first thing that I always talk about. It's important in the house, in your family, you create a culture where you're talking about your body. So what does that look like? For me, I talk about the body tool I need. In fact, I have kids who are preteens. They'll come and they'll say, "Oh, you always have your body tool." And so if my body is feeling overwhelmed or I'm feeling dysregulated, I'm going to call that out and say, I need a break. I need to go to the gym because this is my body tool. This is going to help me regulate right now. And so really talking, I call it body-centric language. I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but really bringing that into the forefront. One, to normalize it, and two, to help your child feel more comfortable. So that's step one that I think should be done in every house. That also creates this, of course, we're accepting because we're all different, because what really is normal? What a silly word. But then when it comes to, okay, do I need to seek more support? This is what I think of. What is the impact? How is it impacting their life? If it is, that's when you go find an OT. And specifically in this world, you want an OT that specializes in sensory.
But also, so many OTs don't work typically with younger kids, don't have the gyms or the equipment to work with kids in bigger bodies. So I was wondering, are there people like adolescent medicine specialists, but in OT?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is a good question. A lot of us, you're right. We started with younger kids. It's something I've been thinking a lot about with Play to Progress is how do we adapt as our kids are getting older? And now, teens are recognizing, wait a second, I have these things going on. And it is helping, them find someone that's a match. And therapy looks very different, but there are plenty of people that do see adolescents. And again, I'm going to call out the Star Institute again, like they have whole programs on this. And they're even talking about sexual health in the sensory system and how that is impacted. So there are plenty of people, and finding that person maybe you have to do some more digging than just Googling OT for a little one.
And so this takes us to a really nice place to land the conversation, which is you've identified this hole, right? That so many parents and caretakers know exists. The need for things like occupational therapy for kids does not end when they get to kindergarten or second grade or fourth grade, but usually persists and shifts in different ways. How can our listeners help the kids in their lives when the variables are changing, when the hormones are surging and the moods feel unpredictable, or when the physical sensations from the body are actually changing, when a kid gets a period for the first time and feels cramps. And this is a new sensation. And the sensory integration of it all has been a challenge all along. And now these new feelings are coming. So help us walk our listeners through managing the shifting landscape for the kids in their lives.
Absolutely. So first, periods are a big one. Why? Think of it. Often kids will start with pads. Well, if I'm sensitive to tactile, what is a pad going to do? It's going to be awful, right? So when it comes to that, I think, again, coming back to first talking about the body. So let's actually go through and talk about the sensation. I like to draw it out. Actually drawing it out, I find can help. There's a lot of great books. I talk about it always in terms of my body to help normalize it first. So we will talk a lot about the body in terms of my body feels X, Y, and Z, and then really go through your body. There's a lot of great body scans on Spotify. I really like doing those. And I do it with a lot of my preteens. Pausing, and we'll talk a bit more. Like, how did that feel? And sometimes it may take an extra second. From there, once you have kind of this is how it feels, now they may not understand how that feels. And that's something we have to work on. But as you build that, you start building tools on top of it, what we call a body toolbox. So what is this body toolbox? It's an actual physical toolbox a lot of times. And in it, you have the tools that they can use to help regulate. I'm not going to say this is always going to be the perfect solution because it's not. And something that may work one time is not going to work the next time. But what I do think is really important is bringing a teen's sensory system and a human sensory system to the forefront. Because if we don't bring it to the forefront, as their body is already changing and life is changing, social dynamics are changing, hormones, there's so many things changing. And they're feeling this in their body. And what do they think? They don't think it's normal. And so by talking about it and adding tools to them, we've now given them, here, you can use this, a physical thing that you can use to help you work through this, to help you regulate. And I think that is extremely important.
And what I'm hearing also is it's a set of tools that can be applied to all of the unknowns that are coming down the road, which is really some of the most overwhelming parts of all of this for anyone who's helping to raise a kid, teaching a kid, coaching a kid. You know what's in front of them now today, but what causes anxiety for the adults in their lives is that we don't know what's in front of them in the future or behind closed doors or on that screen. And having a toolkit that is accessible and actionable allows us to breathe a little bit more and relax into it because these are tools that can be applied and used forever.
Allie, I keep thinking about this concept that we talk about all the time, which is leaving your baggage at the door and thinking about what experiences, emotions, thoughts you carry into the business of parenting a kid, caring for a kid. And this stuff, the sensory stuff, the physical ability, maybe clumsiness, maybe, in my house, it's so funny because we have two people who have a lack of proprioception when they walk down the street. And so two of my kids are always walking in front of my other two kids while they walk down the street because they are not aware of them, like in space next to them. And so it's become a joke now, like, hey, people with no proprioception, can you get out of my way on the sidewalk, please? Right? Like, it's like, but we're naming it and normalizing it and laughing about it because, sometimes laughing about it doesn't feel great, but at least we're recognizing that like everybody's got their own stuff. And that includes us as adults. Like, what things do we feel like we're so proud of because we can do? And what things are we embarrassed about because we can't do? And how does that impact the way we talk to kids about those very activities?
Yeah. And one thing I want to bring up, you said we talk about leaving our baggage at the door. When we're talking about our bodies, and I just want to mention this because I do think it's really, really important. We're not dumping on our children our trauma.
Oh, no.
We are very much just saying, look, I'm going to the gym because that's my body tool. Not, I had the most stressful day at work and this happened and that happened. And now I'm going to the gym and I have to, your tone and how you deliver it is very, very important. Not always easy, but very, very important.
Right. Listeners of this podcast will know you can say whatever you want in your own head, but that does not mean it comes out of your mouth and is available for your kids' ears. But narrating like, oh, I feel like I need to move my body. I feel like I'm low on energy. I got to like go to the gym or walk the dog or like, go in child's pose or whatever. I think I love that idea of really narrating it because then you're modeling for the kid how they begin to think through how they address their body awareness.
I'm picturing you just going into child's pose in the middle of a really stressful situation in your house.
I have this, it's a very weird thing about my family, my extended family, which is like, I grew up with a dad who was an athlete for many years and then didn't take care of himself. And anywhere we were, he would like start stretching. Like we could be like in the middle of the Vatican and he would decide his hamstrings were tight and he'd like lean against a pew and start stretching. Like we literally have pictures of my dad all over the world stretching in totally inappropriate places. But what I learned from that is like, hey, listen to your body and give your body what it needs, no matter where you are. But yes.
Absolutely.
So Allie, I think that's right. Don't dump on them. And that also means like stuff that maybe you weren't good at, right? Or was hard for you. It's not like either, hey, kiddo, this isn't a big deal. Who cares? Get over it. And it's also not like, oh, yes, I was sucked to and nobody ever chose me for teams. And I still carry it with me to this day. And I'm like, sometimes like cry myself to sleep at night. You're also not doing that version of it either.
Exactly. And I love what you said, narrating. Narrating is extremely important when we're talking about the sensory system and in our sensory differences, which we all have.
Right.
And so let's narrate and let's call them out. Let's normalize them.
What you do is so applicable to everyone of every age. We are so lucky to have your wisdom. For people who are looking to dive in and learn more, we will link to your book in the show notes. You mentioned Play to Progress. That is the business that you have set up with facilities across LA doing incredible work. One of the ways that we met, Allie, was very much in a conversation like this, where I was talking to someone with whom you've worked for years and years and years, and I was bemoaning the fact that tween and teen occupational therapy wasn't a thing that was mainstreamed. And she was like, you've got to talk to Allie. And so we are so happy to have you here amplifying what you do. And we will let people know how to find you and people like you and resources that you love. And we hope that some of these skills and tools are integrated into homes and schools and sports programs everywhere because they're key. to happiness and success.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And thank you guys so much for having me.
Thanks, Allie. Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.